Who do you want the Cincinnati Bengals to pick in the first round? Let's review the results from round 2 of our first round pick bracket.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm your host, Jake Liscow. He's your host, James Rapien. We're the Locked On Bengals podcast. We're on YouTube. We're everywhere you get your podcasts. And if you're new to the show, please do hit that subscribe button, and that'll make it easy for you to get this content delivered to your device every day when we upload. And if you like what we're doing, go ahead and hit the thumbs up. And we appreciate all you everydayers out there who have made us your first listen. And we hear from you all the time and love to hear from those of you who self-identify as everydayers, and make sure you let us know that we're your first listen. Nice to know that that's hitting home for some of you. Today, we're going to get into the results from round 2 of our first round pick bracket. And some people have some pretty strong opinions about the positions the Bengals need to draft and when they need to draft them. We're going to talk about wide receiver and why that makes sense for the Bengals on day 2, more than anything else, potentially, in this year's draft. Today's episode sponsored by FanDuel. Right now, you can get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet at FanDuel.com/locked on. And James, we're into the final 4 of the first round pick bracket, the Elite 8 matchups. We started in the Sweet 16, by the way, but the Elite 8 matchups have completed. And we know now that it will be 3 offensive trench players and Brock Bowers in the final 4.
Not shocked. I'll start here. I'm totally fine with it. I'm totally fine with getting Joe Burrow help in one way or another. I'm never going to debate that. I'm not, with the logic of it. And this is what the bracket has come to. And it's going to be either a high-end offensive lineman in the Bengals' eyes, or at least in Locked On Bengals listeners' eyes, or Brock Bowers, who is by far and away, the top tight end in this class. And I think that's a huge cliff. And that's certainly an argument alone. If you want to address tight end, get the best one, who would have been the best one in last year's draft, but you don't have the depth that last year's draft had. So that said, I'm not shocked that these are the final 4. At the same time, I do think that it is a little surprising, and part of it could be seeding, like we've talked about before we started recording, but no Byron Murphy, no Johnny Newton. And Johnny Newton's the one that I think is a big surprise, because I think he's a huge favorite on social media, specifically Bengals Twitter. And this poll was conducted on Bengals Twitter. And so for him to go down, it just shows you where Bengals fans are from an offensive line thirst standpoint. The thirst is real. And they're going all in to potentially help the Bengals in the trenches.
And to be fair, there were a lot of offensive linemen in this bracket from the start. Olu Fashanu,
Sure.
Graham Barton, Troy Fautanu, JPJ, Jackson Powers Johnson, JC Latham, Taliese Fuaga, Amarius Mims, Tyler Guyton. There were a lot of first round.
Because there are a lot of first round offensive linemen in this draft.
That's right.
Yeah.
And for the most part in the first round, the tackles just blew their opposition away. The exception to that being Brock Bowers demolishing Tyler Guyton in a 95-5, 215 matchup. And like you said, maybe the seeding is a problem here. I'm not a professional seeder. Most of this is very arbitrary. The 1 and 2 and 16 and 15 seeds are somewhat deliberately picked. And outside of that, it was like, let's make interesting matchups. Mm-hmm. And some of them apparently were only interesting to me, judging from the way some of the voting went, like the 88-12 Johnny Newton, Terry, and Arnold matchup in the first round that I thought would be closer, or as we discussed previously, the Brian Thomas Jr. upset of Quinyon Mitchell 57-43 in a pretty surprising decision, I thought, from Bengals Twitter. But that's well behind us at this point. And the second round matchups, let's start with the top of the bracket here. The top of the bracket ended up much easier, which, my bad. lesson learned. We'll fix this next year. We'll try to spread this out more if we can. But at the top
It's
of the
going to be
bracket,
harder when it's pick 32.
it is going to be harder.
Might have to expand the field a bit.
Yeah. It was I waffle between starting with 8, 12, and 16 in the first place here, and like giving some guys some, or even like 14, giving 2 first-round buys and figuring it out from there, just because I was trying to figure out how many players were realistic, because you don't want to go too high and include Joe
Sure.
Walt and have Joe Walt just run away with it.
Well, yeah. No, you were right. I'm not debating 16. I'm just saying if they're picking 32 next year,
Yeah.
then it'll probably be a wider net. That's all. And maybe you
It
just
might
do
be.
32 for number 32. Yeah.
It's just a little bit challenging to figure out, where to start, where to finish. Because like if you include, I don't know, who's the Notre Dame tackle, Fisher, in here,
Blake
like
Fisher.
what's the point? What's the point of Blake Fisher being on here? You know what I mean?
No, but he would be in the round 2 bracket.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And so he would be someone, if they were picking 32, we've gone down this rabbit hole. We might just fully commit. If they were picking 32, he's probably included, right? Just because
Maybe.
I think I like him more than Guyton. So there you go.
There's a
You want to
take.
take?
There's a
Is
take.
it? Is it?
I think it is.
I think
it
he'll be
is.
better. I think he'll be better than Guyton.
I think it's a take.
I think Patrick Paul might be better than Guyton too, the guy you hate. PP.
I think also perhaps a take, but
That's
I don't know.
For sure a take.
So
ahead.
the top of the bracket here: Olu Fashanu, Brian Thomas Jr., and Troy Fautanu, J.C. Latham.
Mhm.
Fashanu beating Thomas 74% to 26% after rounding. Fautanu beating Latham 61% to 39%. Is this in line with your voting, James, or did you vote differently on either of these?
No, this is in line, and I think it's close with Latham, and that's the one where it's really close, but it was in line. Let me make sure. I'm 99% sure it was in line. No, it wasn't. I lied. I voted for Latham, not Troy Fautanu, and I think it's the non-testing element of it that scared some people away. I think for what the Bengals want to do, and we know what they want to do. They want to be this big, powerful offensive line. I think J.C. Latham fits that. Troy Fautanu, are they going to use him at tackle right away? Or are they going to plug him in at guard and then teach him tackle next year? I don't know. I think that would be an interesting dynamic. With Latham, I think they would just put him at right tackle and let him cook.
I think one question about Fautanu as well for any NFL team interested in drafting Fautanu is, do they believe he can play tackle? I know he played tackle in college. A lot of people are saying he's going to be best served in the NFL at guard. Yep. There are a lot of very smart evaluators who think that. I think there are NFL teams who are asking that question or have asked that question and have made up their mind. This is a guard. This is a tackle. This is a guard with, Joe Tooney kind of flexibility where if we're desperate for a tackle, we can move him to tackle, but that's not your plan A. And so I think that is an interesting element of the Fautanu Latham debate. I think Latham is a right tackle. I think he has the size for it. I know he didn't test. I think he has requisite movement ability for it, even though he's not a great athlete. Obviously, if he was a great athlete, he would have tested. But I think he has adequate athleticism. And if you listen to Frank Pollock talk about these guys, he was talking about all of these first-round guys with Dave Lapham. He would tell you that J.C. Latham has better than expected athleticism for a guy that's that big.
Mm-hmm.
Not a Marius Mims level athleticism for a guy that's that big, but certainly better than average for a 340-pounder with great length and good height to go with it. And so that one is a little bit surprising in that the fans opted for a guy with very high guard potential in the profile and some questions as to whether or not he can play tackle over the guy that I think is a true tackle. But Fashanu over Thomas, no shock at all there. I think I'm maybe surprised that Thomas even did as well as he did, 74-26 instead of like a 85-15 or something like that. There's some real Brian Thomas fans out there on Bengals Twitter.
Yeah, and it's weird that I'm not like leading the charge. Not that I don't like Brian Thomas, but it's weird that I'm not like, hey, wide receiver at 18. But I'm really not wide receiver at 18. More on that coming up, but we need to continue our bracket conversation up next. And that's exactly what we're going to do right here on Locked On Bengals. Today's show is brought to you by BetterHelp. A lot of us spend our lives wishing we had more time. The question is, time for what? If time was unlimited, how would you use it? The best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and make it a priority. That way you can do and not only find what matters to you, but do more of what matters to you. And therapy can help be that tool that helps bridge that gap so you can prioritize the things that matter most. And if you thought about giving therapy a try, BetterHelp is the perfect solution for you. Why? Well, because you're probably busy. Maybe you're listening to this at 1.5 speed or 2 speed right now, and you're trying to cram Locked On Bengals into your day. Well, BetterHelp is convenient. It's flexible. It will fit any schedule. It's entirely online. It only takes a few minutes to get going. All you have to do is fill out a brief questionnaire, and boom, you'll get matched up with a therapist, and you can switch therapists at any time. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOn today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOn.
So the first Final Four matchup, the Elite Eight matchups we just discussed, Olu Fashanu, Troy Fautanu. That one should be interesting. Both of those guys had easier paths than the guys we're about to talk about. Fautanu beating Verse in the first round, 83-17, and Latham in the second round, 61-39. Fashanu blowing away Graham Barton and then Brian Thomas. So that's our top half of the bracket. In the bottom of the bracket, we had Taliese Fuaga and Johnny Newton in the tightest matchup so far, period. A 53-47 victory for Fuaga, who advances to the Final Four. And then a pretty close matchup as well between Brock Bowers and Byron Murphy, 58-42. That's one of the closer matchups that we've had, the third closest, in fact, matchup so far. So Bowers beating Guyton, beating Murphy. Murphy, who edged Mims in the first round. That was one of the more controversial, according to my replies on Twitter, rulings of the first round or elections of the first round. Newton beating Arnold, Fuaga beating Latu, and then Fuaga beating Newton 53-47. Are these in line with how you voted, James? I assume you voted for Brock Bowers here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I voted for Fuaga too. And that one's close, right? That one's really close. And you almost break the tie with, all right, elite and elite. One can protect Joe Burrow, and he somehow fell to 18, and you weren't necessarily expecting him to, because I don't expect Fuaga to be there at 18. Johnny Newton, I think he could be there because the NFL is weird. I think just weird with interior defensive tackles in general. But there are offensive linemen. This isn't just a default to the offensive line. There are offensive linemen I would pass on for Johnny Newton. Troy Fautanu being one of them, for example. If those two guys have been matched up, I would have probably taken Johnny Newton. So this isn't strictly, all right, it's an offensive tackle, take him. But Fuaga is up there enough to where I think it's close. Even if Newton is a little higher on your board, let's say he's 7th and Fuaga's 10th. All right, well, there's a tiebreaker there. And I think the tiebreaker is Joe Burrow. So close. I voted for Fuaga. And then, yeah, I mean, you know me. Brock Bowers all day long over Byron Murphy. By the way, I voted for Amarius Mims over Byron Murphy. And I'm comfortable saying that and would certainly take Mims over Murphy. And I don't hate Murphy. I just think that it's interesting, like the discourse around him and the discussion, at least here in Cincinnati, where it's like, oh, we'll solve your defensive line issues. And I'm not sure he does that. Like, people have discussed, oh, well, Johnny Newton and size and all of those things. Well, Byron Murphy's smaller. And so are we sure he's going to be this just game-changing interior defensive lineman? Because if he's not that, I don't want him at 18. And I do think there's some depth there. And so for Brock Bowers, there isn't depth at tight end, in my opinion, in this draft. He's far and away not only the best, but one of the best we've seen in quite some time. I'll take him over Byron Murphy because I think you can add defensive linemen later in the draft that'll give you maybe not what Murphy is going to give you, but close to it.
Yeah, I don't think there's the depth in terms of there's a fall off, I guess. Like, defensive tackle in this class, very top heavy. There are some guys that should be good NFL players after Murphy and Newton. But, also true for tight end. not a deep tight end class at all. It's a pretty bad tight end class outside of Brock Bowers and a handful of guys. There might be some contributors, but the consensus is it's a pretty bad tight end class. But it's not a great defensive tackle class. There are just more guys later that can help, and then it's just a positional value thing. Like, do you care about tight end? And obviously, the answer for you is yes, right? Especially when it's a guy like Bowers who is a run after catch guy, a matchup problem. He can block a little bit. He's not going to be totally mismatched as a blocker. Does have maybe slight size concerns if you're looking for the elite prototypical does everything tight end. Like, he's not going to come in and be Rob Gronkowski. We saw them beside each other on Radio Row at the Super Bowl. They're slightly different body types, to put that nicely. But doesn't mean he can't come in and be an adequate blocker and be a mismatch problem and use that really good tight end athleticism that he possesses and ability and feel for the game to be a game-changing weapon in the NFL. The question with Bowers is the same question that plagues every single tight end discussed in the first round: is what makes him different from the other tight ends in the first round? What makes him worth that pick, especially when you start to think about things like surplus value in terms of how much are you saving compared to a top end tight end contract when you draft a tight end in the first round, and the potential learning curve that tight ends sometimes have coming into the league. And people might talk about Kyle Pitts, who still I think could be good if he was in the right offense and started his career quite well, or TJ Hawkinson or Noah Fant as other first round tight ends. You could reminisce all the way back to Tyler Eifert, who, when Tyler Eifert was healthy, was a game changing tight end for the Cincinnati Bengals before he had his career derailed by injuries. But those are narratives, I think, that have to be combated and honestly discussed even in the war room when you think about taking a tight end in the first round, and that applies to Brock Bowers too.
Sure. And I think it should apply to Byron Murphy too. That's the element here. Are we sure he's a game wrecker? I don't think so. I think Johnny Newton is, potentially. I'm not sure Byron Murphy is. And so could Brock Bowers be a game changer? I think that's more likely than Byron Murphy. Sure. Now, the positional value thing, I get it. And that's kind of what broke the tie last year, I think, with a Miles Murphy versus a Sam Laporta, who we know the Bengals liked. Mm-hmm. Maybe not enough to take at 28, but damn it, they liked him. Bowers is better. Let's call it like it is. He's better. He's a better prospect, and he's more productive. And I think he fits what you're going to do or try to do. And so that's where I'm at. Now, with a guy like Murphy, could he come in and help fill a need right away? Absolutely. But I think a lot of people in town, whether it's fans, people that cover the team, think that that's like the solution. And now your defensive line is fixed. I don't know if that's true anyways. And so I'm open to defensive line, certainly at 18 for the first time since 1994. If the Bengals want to go that route in round one, I also think that this is their shot to get a game-changing type player. And whether that's someone who's going to block for Burrow and keep Burrow upright so he can make those game-changing plays, whether that's a weapon like Brock Bowers, or whether that's someone like Johnny Newton that just gets after opposing quarterbacks all the time. I think that's where I'm at. I think it's tough. Again, Byron Murphy, I'm a little lower on him, I think, than consensus. And
yeah, it's just from a positional value perspective, you only get really good game-changing defensive tackles in the top 30 picks or so. It's really hard to find them outside of the first round. Not true for tight end. And you throw all that out.
It is in this year's class. This year's class sucks.
Oh yeah, no
There's
doubt.
A reason everyone's talking about Ben Sinnott.
But you throw, what I was going to say to finish the thought is, you throw all that out and you look at the individual prospects each year. Yeah. It's probably true that you're not getting a game-wrecking defensive tackle outside of the first round this year. It's definitely true that you're not getting a game-wrecking tight end outside of the first round this year. And so then you have the positional value debate. Fuaga Newton, an interesting one. Fuaga edging out Newton here. A lot of people were saying, you know what, this should have been the final. But the way the bracket was made, some amateur put this bracket together, didn't know what he was doing, didn't think about the second round matchups. And so that's what we got in the second round.
I'm glad it wasn't the final, because I don't think both guys would have escaped. Not with Brock Bowers as a 2 seed, baby. Even if those guys were 1 seeds on their sides, let's say. Brock would have taken one of them out. And we'll see this round, obviously, with Fuaga and Brock.
Yeah, we can do some hypothetical polls after this is all said and done and do the Brock Bowers Johnny Newton matchup and do some, alternate universe, multiverse matchup, some multiverse of the round one bracket. Anyway, that's where we are for the Final Four. We'll be kicking that off here shortly on Twitter. Keep an eye on @Jake Liscow on Twitter for that Final Four poll. Coming up next, let's talk about why the Bengals might take a wide receiver on day 2. Some people are very upset about this in our comments on YouTube, James, and have very strong opinions. We'll finish the show there next.
Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. The sports calendar is loaded, and FanDuel's making it even more exciting to get in on the action. Whether it is women's college hoops in their Final Four, whether it is Dan Hurley and the UConn Huskies in the Final Four again, being overlooked, according to Dan. We'll see if they can finish the job, or heck, Purdue. How about that? Purdue making it to the Final Four for the first time since 1980. You can wager on college hoops right now. And new customers with FanDuel get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 that you can use to bet on the tourney, MLB, NBA, NHL, and so much more. Red season is already here, and the NBA playoffs are right around the corner. So it's the perfect time to get in on the action with FanDuel. Again, get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet at FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon, and make your first bet a big win. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook.
You know what's funny, James, as we transition to talk about wide receiver here? If you look at Lance Zierlein's top, 20 guys, top 40 guys or so,
Yeah.
he would disagree with a lot of the results of our bracket so far. JC Latham is Lance's top-rated tackle, but Jared
Okay.
Verse has a higher grade than any offensive tackle in the class from Lance. So he would look at that first-round defeat that Jared Verse took and be like, what the heck are you guys doing in Cincinnati? Same for Laiatu Latu. And, in fact, one of the funnier things I noticed here as I was looking at this.
He has Laiatu Latu ahead of Fuaga, huh? Interesting.
Ahead of Fuaga. He also has Graham Barton graded higher than Olu Fashanu. So it is interesting. There are opinions out there. But anyway, what we're going to talk about to finish up the show today is Bengals targeting a wide receiver on day 2. There's going to be a lot of wide receivers picked on day 2 of this draft. I think there is a fall off after day 2 of the draft. There are some potential slot options that could be available in round 4 and 5 that are guys that I'd be happy for the Bengals to target if that's what they were interested in. If they're looking for a guy that's going to be a, Tyler Boyd kind of 95% slot player.
Luke McCaffrey, come on down.
And Brendan Rice could potentially be one in the 4th round if he makes it there. But what we've talked about when we talk about a 2nd round wide receiver are a couple of things. One, versatility, guy who can line up outside, inside, gives Jamar Chase the ability to play outside, inside a little bit more freely. T. Higgins to move into the slot on the rare occasion they do that sort of thing this year. Also, potentially, not that this is something we're expecting at this point at all, gives them that license to trade T. Higgins at some point, should that be something that is in their plans at all, which we don't think it is. But that being the smallest point, one, drafting a guy who can play anywhere gives you that future potential wide receiver 2, which is something they need. Sure, they could go after it next year. You never know what next year is going to bring. And that has been a common point that I've heard, James. And 2 is that versatility and that impact in 2024, allowing Jamar Chase to play more freely in the slot, allowing yourself to be more versatile, allowing yourself to do more with motion, and not necessarily have the opposing team know exactly where everyone's going to be on every play based on your personnel.
No doubt. And that's the element here. It's not just about the future and replacing T. It's about making this team better now. And one way you can make them better is giving them more options and giving them another deep threat, giving them someone that can line up, you're right, in the slot, line up outside, allow Jamar Chase to play in the slot more, and be another wrinkle. And it's so funny because even last year, but certainly this year, or the past couple of years, last year, not as much after the top guys, but it was like, it's so deep at receiver. And it is deep at receiver this year. But if you want a guy that can play both and can be a deep threat and isn't 5'8" and 160 and I'm just making it, but hits all of these metrics that the Bengals have used and have had success with, then it gets shallow really quick. And that's the argument. It's pretty simple. I get the trenches are a huge priority, and they should be, but they can't get in the way from a team building standpoint of realizing, one, the Bengals could use another deep threat today, even if T. Higgins got extended today, even if Trenton Irwin was under contract past this year, even if we knew Andre Yosevash and Charlie Jones were good NFL players. And I think they've shown some, specifically Andre as a receiver, but we still don't know. We don't know what they're going to be. Trenton Irwin's under a 1-year contract. And so it's Charlie Jones, Andre Yosevash, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins in a contract year on the tag. You need some reinforcements. So not only do I think that the Bengals, that they'll seriously consider one on day 2 and as early as pick 49, I think that they could very easily double down at receiver again this year and take one of those other slot receivers on day 3 in round 5, in round 6, because you need to replenish a wide receiver room that as of now could use another deep threat, and 2, a little more versatility. Plus after this year, you could be losing T. Higgins, Trenton Irwin, and that wide receiver room gets really, really shallow if you lose those guys.
You talk about doubling down and some of the slot guys on day 3. A name that I'm almost certainly going to include in my predictive mock for the Bengals is Jacob Cowing. I know I've talked about him a few times. The Bengals were out there for Arizona to work him out. That's not the only reason. He is a very young breakout age player, and the Bengals love receivers who had early young production in college. He has one of the highest breakout age percentiles in this class, only behind Xavier Worthy, I think, at 96% and Worthy's 97 percentile. So that is a guy that I think that they could be looking at later. But to your point, James, I think this is a team that really values having 3 good wide receivers. And we've seen that time and time again. I know that they drafted 2 guys last year, but the guys they drafted last year were day 3 dart throws. And the reason I call them that, not to take anything away from them, because they showed some things. Both of them showed some things as rookies that suggest they could have NFL futures in different roles, but they were older and they did not hit the breakout age profile that the Bengals almost always hit. They were sore thumb standouts in terms of an exception to the rule that the Bengals apply to their wide receiver draft profile. And so even projecting that they would continue to develop is a real question, because typically, with guys that come into the league older and didn't have that young production, you don't often see a ton of NFL development. Not to say that is impossible. I don't have anything personally against Yoshi or Charlie Jones. I think both guys could be contributors in different ways this year. But you don't want to necessarily bank on that. And if you go into 2025 with Jamar Chase and some guys, which is what could end up being the case, in a really good receiver class, and I know there are a lot of really good receiver classes, but the same way we talk about this tackle class being really good, it would make sense to dip into the strength of a phenomenal and varied wide receiver class where many of them tick all the boxes you want. And we know the Bengals love drafting wide receiver. We talked about that all year last year going into the draft, how they're definitely going to pick a couple receivers that year. And it wouldn't surprise to see at least one or even 2, to your point, James, this year.
Well, because let's just say that, like, I did a mock earlier this week for SI, and so I've talked about Troy Franklin a ton on the pod. But if they take Troy Franklin, does that keep them from taking Jacob Cowing or taking Luke McCaffrey or taking insert whatever slot? Maybe you like Washington out of USC as one of these slot guys, or heck, Washington out of Virginia?
Yeah.
I don't think so. I think that you're still open there. And part of it is they have 10 picks. And part of it is you could be looking at a wide receiver room pretty realistically. That is in 2024 or 2025, excuse me, Jamar Chase, the 2nd round pick, the insert whatever other round pick, and then Charlie Jones and Andre Yosevash. Like, those could be your 5. Taking Andre Yosevash last year, that's kind of like your Stanley Morgan replacement in a way. That's who he beat out for that roster spot last year. And Charlie Jones, he doesn't necessarily have to be your Tyler Boyd replacement. And he can be a step below that and be your those guys can be your wide receiver 4 and wide receiver 5 long term. And so that's what I think is hard for some people to wrap their heads around. And that's probably what should happen is Andre be your wide receiver 4 and Charlie Jones be in the mix in the slot, and we'll see if they take a step forward. But if they don't, you have other plans in place. So why take a wide receiver early? The last time they took a wide receiver early, it panned out pretty well, didn't it? 5th overall.
They're really good at drafting receiver.
Yeah, that too.
Generally, they're really good at drafting receiver. And in a class as stacked at receiver, I would trust them to make that pick. That being said, a lot of people feel like it needs to be trenches early, and we'll talk about that as well. We'll discuss the pros and cons there. I'm with you, James. I don't see first-round receiver as a likelihood or even necessarily a wise move for this team. And I think it would change if they picked Brock Bowers. If you pick Brock Bowers, maybe the priority on receiver later in the draft also changes. If you go Brock Bowers in the first round, maybe your day 2 is dedicated to the trenches. But
sure. No doubt. Bowers completely changes how I think they attack wide receiver. I still think they probably take one, but it might not be until day 3.
Right. And so what they do in the first round does impact things, but if they go trench in the first round, as we kind of expect, I think round 2, round 3 are wide open for wide receiver. And I think that's realistic. And that's why we're talking about it. It's not just a James Rapien skill player fever dream. This is a real thing for the Cincinnati Bengals this year.
No doubt. People think I'm whatever. All right.
No, it's a real thing this year. That's going to do it for this episode of the Locked On Bengals.
It was a real thing last
podcast.
year with Kincaid, in my defense.
It was. It was, and Laporta.
Yep.
That's going to do it for this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. Until next time, thanks for listening. Hoo day, and have a good one.
Skill players matter.